I think all sensible people have the British Constitution as one of their hobbies. It is the most interesting matter to discuss and be informed about. As Dicey argued, it is Parliament that is the defender of the liberties of the people, of our ancient Constitution and of our freedoms. I give way. Hello, this is Jacob Rees-Mogg. I'm doing this podcast from home today, and so if there are background noises from Sixtus, I hope it doesn't distract too much. But one of the answers to the questions why Parliament works is to deliver for the people. And so far in this series, I've been exploring different perspectives on the way in which Parliament achieves this through legislation. But there is one perspective missing, a glaring omission I'm delighted to be able to put right today. Viz. The role of the Commons clerks, those high priests of our democracy who understand to the very fibres of their being the intricacies of parliamentary procedure. They advise every MP alike, in office or in opposition, on the backbenches or the front benches, and they are headed by the Clerk of the House, technically the underclerk of the Parliaments. Aside from opening the batting from England, this must surely be one of the most noble jobs in the kingdom. Certainly one of the most respected is Robert Rogers, Lord Lisvane, who has served Parliament for 4 decades, including more than a decade as a clerk at the table. Robert was clerk from October 2011 to October 2014. He was subsequently elevated to the peerage in late 2014, where he now sits as a crossbencher. Lord Lisvane, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you very much, Jacob. It's going to be an effort to live up to that encomium.
Well, I think you will find it an absolute breeze, as I have a long list of questions for you. But I want to start by getting your thoughts on the lawmaking process. My last discussion was with the first Parliamentary Counsel, Elizabeth Gardner, who heads the team of government lawyers who draft the bills put before the House. Here's what she had to say about bills which end up being heavily amended.
And we use a sort of analogy in the office that, you've crafted a beautiful elephant and you get it into Parliament and they decide that they actually want a crocodile. And so you're hacking bits off your bill and adding some teeth and taking off the trunk. And it may look a bit like a crocodile when it finishes, but it doesn't look as nice a crocodile as it would have done if you'd known from the start that you were designing a crocodile. So having the structure in the right place when you introduce into Parliament and being able to maintain that structure throughout Parliament is really important.
Of course, Elizabeth is quite right that bills can become somewhat garbled, but she is also the first to recognise that the process of scrutiny and amendment is a necessary and important part of Parliament's work. Lord Lisvane, you must have sat at the table in the chamber of the House of Commons for countless bills. I suspect you have seen some wonderful-looking elephants and crocodiles in your day. How would you reflect on your time as clerk in the Commons?
From the legislative point of view, I think that there is, of course, you're immensely well aware of the House's theatre, and very often there is a theatrical element to consideration of legislation on the floor of the House, perhaps less so in standing committee. I mean, in the days before programming, I well remember the cheer that used to go up when you'd clocked up 100 hours, because that meant that the government of the day would introduce a guillotine. And as I say, that was pre-programming. I think that there are quite a few elements about the way we legislate which have become clearer to me over the years. One is that, it's very interesting to hear you quoting Elizabeth Gardner, and I've worked very happily and constructively with her over a number of years. I think in a sense, you need to go back to the point of initiation, where the government really does need to decide how much it wants an elephant, and whether actually having undertaken consultations, fitted the proposed bill into the rest of the legislative timetable and all the rest, whether the Parliamentary Business and Legislation Committee needs to be tougher about the elephantine characteristics of the bill.
And Looking at your career in the House of Commons, do you think the primary legislative process has become more or less efficient? Do you think in 2020 it is easier or harder to get a new bill on the statute book than it was when you first started working in the House of Commons?
Well, first of all, I'm always very wary of the word efficient.
Yes, indeed.
It's like the word reform, which or modernization, come to that.
That's a terrible word, one of my least favourite.
I thought I would strike a chord there, my interpretation of those words is this is change of which the person speaking approves. It is not something which is objectively to be evaluated. So I use, and I would use instead of efficient, I use instead of reform, I use effectiveness. How effective is the House at looking at legislation? And I think that the programming of legislation brought in 97 reduced the effectiveness. It was a very worthy aim, in other words, to concentrate the House's scrutiny efforts on the real issues which divided the two sides or the more than two sides in the House. But of course, as you know, very rapidly, it became a more effective or efficient, if you like, way for the government of the day to get its business through. And undoubtedly, it meant that larger parts of, although the intention was very different, that large parts of bills still went, in practical terms, unscrutinized. Now, I've been a bit of as you know, a bit of a radical on some of these matters over the years. And there are some things which they did better in the 19th century. One of them was to have motions to bring in bills where you actually debated the need to legislate before you started looking at the legislation which fulfilled that need. And it's not irrelevant that when the closure was introduced by Speaker Brand in February 1881, it was actually on a motion to bring in a bill, the Protection of Property and Person Ireland Bill, not on the second reading of the bill itself. So, I think there are lessons from the past which we might reconsider. Now, of course, one of the crucial things, and I know from a practical governmental point of view how difficult it is to meet this aspiration, is the use of draft bills committed to a select committee, or sometimes even better, a joint committee. You tie up more drafting resources, and I think Elizabeth Gardner would be quick to point that out, but at the same time, you allow outside access to the process. And that's one of the great things, of course, which select committees of all types do. They allow outside evidence, the application of outside knowledge and opinion. And although I realize how difficult it is when you've got the overall pressures on a legislative programme, I think it's a great pity that we haven't used draft bills a very, very great deal more over the years.
Yes, I mean, seeing it from the PBL point of view, draft bills are quite difficult because of the time pressures that you have in getting the business through during the cycle that you've got of parliamentary sessions and of general elections. But the effort to ensure that bills are better written is, I think, an important one. And indeed, learning from the past, the more traditional route of green paper, white paper bill seems to me a very good way of proceeding, because that allows views to come out before the bill hits Parliament.
Yes, absolutely. And I entirely accept, certainly in the first session of a Parliament, draft bills are really difficult because you've got all the pressures of time are exacerbated at that point. Something that I'm very keen on, and I don't know how much traction this might have, but I'm very keen on purpose clauses. Now, I'm not suggesting that that is a way of, as it were, dodging the issue and leaving more to be done by the courts. Certainly not. But it seems to me that there is a mismatch between the often very complex clockwork, which has to be legislatively drafted, and the political issues which lie behind it. And it has been used a few times very, very successfully in the Banking Temporary Provisions Bill and the Banking Bill about 10 years ago now, and in one or two other bills. But I think it would be a way of having a much more sensible debate on the issues without having to use, as it were, the woodcraft of amendment to expose the issues by trying to deal with the clockwork, if that makes sense.
I understand exactly what you mean, because I was actually looking at a bill that we are bringing forward, and when you just try to read it straight through, and it cross-references other bills which it is amending, it's very difficult to be certain of the purpose without doing considerable further work, and that something that helps people understand legislation is, I think, useful as it's being debated. But you mentioned amendments, and this is where early on I found it so fascinating that as a backbench MP, you can go and see a very senior clerk. When I first did it, David Nartzler, your successor, was the clerk of legislation, and get this incredible and high-powered help in trying to do something that the government probably doesn't want. And the independence, the fairness of the clerks is something that always struck me.
Well, it's kind of you to say that, and if David gave you advice, I know that it would have been outstandingly good advice. Yes, I mean, I've always summed up, and in latter years to new clerks coming to the House, the role is to make possible, in parliamentary terms, most nearly what the member wants to achieve in political terms. And I've, again, always discouraged too much of a reliance on standing orders and the rest of the accretions over the years as a sort of a rule book, because that has to be interpreted with an element of, and I used to call it woodcraft, which I think is pretty close to the mark, where it's a mix of understanding what a member wants to do, with what are likely to be the political challenges, what is going to be the best tactical route. So it's one of the things I think that makes the role a fascinating one.
Well, yes, because there's usually a way of doing things, isn't there? Even if other people have tried very carefully to make sure that there isn't. If you, as you put it, try and find the parliamentary route to achieve the political aim. And that's where clerkly advice is so helpful, because you are, in that sense, the guardians of the Constitution, of what can and can't be done, and can point people in the right direction.
Yes, I think that's fair. And again, I remember as a very young clerk in 1972, and I had views about things, and I thought, oh heavens, how difficult is it going to be truly impartial and independent? And the moment you start doing it in the parliamentary context, you realize actually it's a very straightforward thing, and to be irreverent about it, if the amount of ordure hitting you from one side and from the other is about equal, you're probably going down the middle of the fairway.
Yeah, and it's a wonderful intellectual challenge, isn't it? Because you're trying to work out what the precedent is and how something can be done. And in a way, the more difficult it is, the more obscure, the more interesting it is to find the route.
That's absolutely right. And certainly one of the things that I used to do, in a sense, I'm harking back to my mention of the 19th century habit of motions to bring in bills. But one of the things that I used to do, and I don't have a complete set of Erskine May here at home in Herefordshire, but I always used to go back to the early editions of May, because very often something would have been viewed slightly differently. Practice might have changed, and then a subsequent editor of May said, well, I don't think I'm going to give that house room in my edition. But it can be a fascinating lesson as to how the House's practice has developed and indeed, to use the word again, accreted over the years.
It is very interesting that. I can give you an example from last year, which I think is no longer indiscreet, on humble addresses. A humble address was passed, and then there was a prorogation, the second prorogation rather than the first. And the first, I think, dozen editions of May said that a prorogation knocked out a humble address. After that, for a few editions, it said it didn't, and then it stopped talking about them altogether. And this made for a fascinating argument. As you can imagine, I was arguing from the government's point of view that clearly the early May was right and the later May was wrong. And the fact that it had been forgotten about just showed how unusual these processes were. But it struck me as absolutely fascinating and an indication of how little set in stone things are. I mean, this is just an example of why it's so interesting, the way our constitution has evolved and not being codified. And what I was saying earlier about the clerks being the sort of high priests of Parliament, I've always thought that you have a great authority because of the continuity of the clerkship, because of its independence, that you're appointed by the Crown, not by the government, and you hold office until you retire, and that your knowledge means that you can give guidance that people accept out of authority, rather than, in most cases, there being a clear right or wrong answer.
I think that's fair, and that distills really what clerks should and do aim for. I mean, you are doing, again, over the years, speaking to audiences who perhaps aren't very familiar with Parliament, I've taken the example of the table office, where somebody, with maybe the opposition whips, come in and say, well, we've got this splendid ambush we can spring on the government tomorrow night. And you sit down with them and you hone and streamline their plan to make it more effective. And then 10 minutes later, you're asked by the government what would happen if, and you find yourself sitting down with a different constituency of member, trying to think how to sabotage the advice you've given only a short time before. And I always say that if you think as a result of that we're all raving schizophrenics, it's not. It's simply because we're trying to do the best for our client at the time, which is one way of looking at it.
And it's crucial that whoever is consulting you asks the right question.
Yes.
Because you won't show a route to them that would betray any confidence or indicate that you'd been thinking about it before. And that's very interesting too, because I've certainly found if I've been, I'm afraid to say, prior to my previous role, normally trying to frustrate the government rather than help it, if 2 or 3 people have gone to see the clerks, they've ended up with different answers, not because the clerks have a different view, but because they've asked very slightly different questions and therefore haven't necessarily got to the answer that they want.
Yes. Well, I think that is, it can be a very subtle process. I don't know how best to describe it. Perhaps advice shopping might be the best. Where you do find member A goes and asks clerk B, and then a short time later asks clerk C, and looks at the. It's a little bit like taking a bearing at sea, and you're quite right that although there's always room for nuances, and indeed there is room for more than one view to be taken, you've got to ask the right questions. But almost more important is that you've got to start by asking questions, because if a clerk volunteers a way forward, in a sense that is already being parti pris. But the moment you say, now, what would be the best way of achieving X, then it's Liberty Hall.
Absolutely. But this leads on to the next thought of mine, is that I sort of alluded to this a bit earlier, but I was really struck when I was first elected about the amazing appearance of time that clerks have, that you go to a very busy clerk as a very junior member of Parliament, and they will be as helpful as they possibly can be. And yet you're trying to look after and service 650 MPs. How did you always manage to appear as if whatever not necessarily crucial question you were being asked was one to which you were willing to give time and exercise your brain power?
I think the answer to that lies in the structure and culture of what used to be the Clerks Department and is now part of the wider House of Commons service, in that you're talking to a body of practitioners, almost a college of clerks, and the interest of an individual request for advice, an individual problem, is always something which is very attractive. It actually can lead to less urgent and interesting and attractive issues perhaps being put on the back burner for the time being. So you're not dealing with an engine of state, which is through meetings and perhaps files and memoranda and so on, is moving from state X to state Y. You're dealing with individual problems, which you take to an individual. And for that individual clerk, they are a very high priority. I think the other conditioning factor is simply speed, because from your first days as the most junior and callow clerk, you realize that things do not solve themselves if you leave them alone. They're far more likely to blow up in some shattering way. So the Pavlovian instinct to deal with things quickly and on the spot, I think, is inculcated from a very early stage.
Yes, and therefore, as you're dealing with things with dispatch, you've got time, and this is sort of, I suppose, underpins the whole of the conversation that you are advising everybody, and it's part of the difference between Parliament and the government, isn't it? That many people think that Parliament and the government is broadly the same, whereas the government merely has to have a majority in Parliament. How do you think that could be made clearer to people that the two are separate?
I think it's, in a sense, it's instinct in the relationship between the two institutions, because we don't have a separation of powers. You have to look more carefully at ways in which the government in Parliament is behaving like the government, and the way in which its members are behaving as individual parliamentarians. But in a sense, the subset of what we were discussing a moment ago is that very often the impartiality is not between individual parties. It may well be between an individual rebel and his or her party. And, without giving away any even now posthumous secrets, that was the sort of thing which, in many amusing and constructive conversations I had over the years with Tam Diel, that was something which was brought very much to the forefront of my mind.
Yes, and he was a very impressive parliamentarian and a very kindly man as well.
He was a lovely man, and I knew him and Kathleen very well. And from time to time, they used to come and stay with us after Tam had retired. So there was no conflict of interest, if I can put it that way.
No.
But one of the things about Tam was that some of the things that he did, and he would have admitted it and did admit it, were absolutely mad, and they completely missed the point. But there were enough things where he actually hit the target square on, which made the point about an independent member who was prepared to do the work.
Yes, and the parliamentary work, because there's quite a conflict for MPs, isn't there, between the constituency work and the parliamentary work. Have you seen that balance shift over your career?
Oh, hugely. Absolutely. It's been transformative. When I came to the House, there were, I think, 25 members, researchers, of course, slightly shifting population, and some secretaries did work which was more research, but nevertheless, it was tiny compared with the huge number of members' staff now, both at Westminster and in the constituencies. Now, in one way, I think that's a very good thing because it reflects what constituents expect from their Member of Parliament. But at the same time, the effect over the years has been to shift the focus of members from the big issues of the day, where they are parliamentarians first, almost more than representatives, has moved that to an existence which is dominated by casework, by maintaining a local profile, where there is, if I dare say so, there is quite a lot of pressure for activity to take precedence over achievement. And one of the things I think which in very recent years has made that much more problematical is the growth and the abuse of social media. I mean, when used sensibly and properly, it's constructive, although I have to say I'm not a partaker myself, but nevertheless, it is, you will know very much better than I, it has imposed terrific extra strains on individual members.
Yes, though only if you read it.
Yes. I wasn't personalising this.
No, I know, but I think people have to be sensible about their involvement with social media and recognise that if you go on Twitter, you will annoy some people who will phrase themselves extravagantly in return. Though it does for some people, it gets very, very nasty. And does increase pressure, as you say, to do things that don't necessarily do more than give an appearance of activity. But you can also do things in Parliament, can't you, that don't necessarily achieve something on day one, but put pressure on what you might think of as a monolithic government. And I'm thinking here of adjournment debates and Westminster Hall debates and even select committee inquiries, that you can use Parliament to pressurise, to push for what you're trying to get the government to do without having the absolute certainty that it will work, but that actually, if you make enough of a nuisance of yourself in Parliament, most of the time a ministry will give way.
I think that's absolutely spot on, if I may say so. I mean, it is the delayed drop effect. And you see that particularly in select committees, where, and very often the utility of a select committee is that it can come to unanimous views and recommendations, which an individual party would be quite scared to do. In the past, examples have been about the way in which different drugs are treated as to whether they're legal or illegal. Now, that is a very dangerous area for a political party to get into, but it's something which a select committee can do with far less trepidation. And the other thing, of course, is that you can have very challenging recommendations, which the government of the day, in the within 2 months formal reply to a select committee, is pretty unwelcoming of, let's say, to put it at its minimum. But nevertheless, the delayed drop effect can mean that actually you see those recommendations changing minds. And if there's a change of administration, of course, they may be more likely to be adopted.
Yes. And do you think the select committees have been strengthened following the right reforms?
I think there is, yes, sorry, I'm hedging, yes and no. In one sense, I mean, let's take the election of the people to chair committees. If they're elected by the House, that gives them a particular sort of authority. But at the same time, there is a downside because they no longer depend on keeping their committee together as their own power base, because their power base comes from the House itself. And that's not always a good thing. But I think however you change structures, the thing that will matter in the end is how well a committee does its job, how well it really draws upon evidence, and how ready members are to leave all their previous baggage. I don't necessarily mean political baggage, but the baggage of their previous opinions at the committee door when they take part in an inquiry. And that's always been the case, I think, since the realization 40, 50 years ago of how influential select committees could be. Because, of course, the select committees, they could have made greater strides much earlier if it had not been for two disastrous ones, one on the Jameson raid and one on the Marconi share scandal.
Yes.
Where they split bitterly on party and personal lines, and the brand, I think, was tainted for quite a long time. So there was a lot of ground to be made up.
Indeed, and I mean, I served on the Treasury Select Committee under Andrew Tyree, who also did the Banking Commission. And the Banking Commission was really, I think, the first time since the Marconi report that the Houses of Parliament had managed to do the big in-depth report to a major crisis, and managed to do it in a much more timely way than other inquiries have tended to do. I mean, he was a very impressive chairman of the Treasury Select Committee too, and managed to get a unanimous report about 6 weeks before the Brexit referendum on the whole question of the Brexit referendum, with people like me on it and people of entirely opposing views. And he did that by really careful and clever chairmanship, and delivered a report that I think stood the test of time. And I think the chairman is so important in select committees.
Yes, I absolutely agree. And Andrew, I think, would be happy for me to say now that he and I had a number of conversations when he was chairing the commission and I was clerk of the House. And it was very interesting to see the working methods of the commission develop in the way that they did. And it was a great success, as it turned out. I think it also made the point that you don't have to, if you're aiming at agreed recommendations, they can be very powerful. The mere fact of reaching agreement doesn't mean to say that they have to lose force because they're a compromise. And that, when members operate in the surroundings of a select committee, when they operate in that impartial and independent way, I think that's very good for Parliament.
Yes, it helps Parliament to assert its authority and show itself to be relevant. Now, one of the things I wanted to ask you about, which isn't really the relevance of Parliament, but is the continuation of the physical building. You've been involved in Restoration and Renewal since before it was called Restoration and Renewal. And we need a Parliament building that functions, don't we? So where do you think we are going on that? And do you think that the British people are willing to bear the cost?
Well, you're right. I mean, I was, together with my opposite number in the Lords, I actually initiated the whole process by commissioning the structural survey, the condition report, which moved into the Deloitte consortium's analysis, which moved into the subsequent stages, which have become very familiar. And I did that because I felt that we could not discharge our stewardship of the extraordinary building, and indeed the position that it holds in the hearts of the nation, the way it's seen internationally and all the rest, without doing something about it. And if you look over the years, the excuses which have been given for doing nothing have been many and varied, and most of them have been predictable: too embarrassing, too expensive, too soon after the war, which gives you quite a good historical perspective. And we've now got to the position, I think, where the risk is that there really will be a catastrophic failure of services or something which makes the building completely unusable. Now, there are little things, big things perhaps. If you go down and people see the principal floor, looks absolutely fine. If you go down to what I christened the Cathedral of Horror, down in the basement, and you see all the services overlain, just as they've been introduced year after year, decade after decade, and lots of wires and pipes, which even our wonderful estate staff don't really know where they come from and don't really know where they go to, then you get a glimpse of the risk. And a former prime minister said to me, "I'm very much opposed to moving out." And I said, "Well, maybe so, but if the main sewer goes, you'll be moving out on Thursday, never mind 2025. So that was always something that I had sitting on my shoulder when I was corporate officer, because that and the risk of fire, and you know how frequently fires do occur, and you know the state of fire compartmentation, which has gone a long way to go,
Indeed.
Used to worry me. That really was a wake up at 3 a.m. worrying issue. So the short answer is, I think we've really got to get on with it. The time we've had is an awfully long time to be lucky, and I'm not sure how much luckier we are going to be.
You're beginning to sound like Clint Eastwood. Do you feel lucky? And I share your concern. My major concern is fire, which really worries me. I know big steps have been made, but nonetheless, we're told that the building is life secure, therefore everybody could be evacuated, but is not building secure. The building couldn't necessarily be saved. And the need to ensure that we are safe is, I think, overwhelmingly important. It is such an important building really as a statement of the nation's belief in democracy, if that doesn't sound too pompous. But if you think of what our Victorian ancestors were doing when they built it to show how proud they were of our constitution, and therefore it was worth spending a huge amount of money on. So I'm very much in favour of ensuring that the building works and functions, and I recognise this will be very expensive. If it could be done with us staying in, I would prefer it, but it's got to be done one way or another. There's one final question I wanted to throw at you. You've now gone to the Lords, the Elysian Fields, as Disraeli called them, and I just wondered, do you sit there as the procedures in the Lords go on, thinking, goodness, they don't do it properly in this place? Or do you sit there thinking, I wish I could have done that in the House of Commons?
In a sense, neither. I do remember that the day that my peerage was announced, Tam Diel rang me up, and he said, "Now look," he said, in a very Tam way, he said, "Now look, Robert, you're not to lecture them on procedure." And I said, "Tam, so far as I know, I don't think the Lords has much procedure, and what procedure they do have, I simply don't understand. So there's not going to be much chance of that." And I think I'd answer your question by saying you can never transfer practices between jurisdictions. You can pick up issues, you can pick up particular ways of doing things that you might find attractive, but they're not going to work when they're simply shoehorned into a different culture. And I think that is the real answer to your question, that the Lords is so different, and its history is so different, and its outlook is so different, and responsibilities are so different, that you really can't make the comparison. One thing I would say, though, is that I am very, very strongly in favour of bicameralism, because I think when the two houses act in a complementary way, they do identifiably similar things, but they do them in different ways, then I think the whole is much more than the sum of the parts. And I think that to pick up the theme with which we started our conversation, I think that is really good for Parliament in the context of its relationship with the people and with the executive.
Well, I completely agree with that. I think bicameralism is essential to the way our constitution functions, and a good working relationship between Lords and Commons based on the conventions works to everybody's advantage. And you see this with statutory instruments that we were spending time on earlier, that the Lords scrutinises them much more carefully than the Commons, and from time to time just finds routine mistakes and saves the government from passing laws that wouldn't actually function. So I entirely agree with you on bicameralism. I think it is if you look around the world, it is a system that works well. Well, on that note of agreement, I feel we could go on all day. It is from first hearing you talk, I remember as a new MP, you addressed us in the chamber and gave us some very useful pieces of advice of how to behave as a member of Parliament. One of which I took very much to heart. You said, always sit in the same place, because then the Speaker will begin to know who you are, and you've got a better chance of being called. And I did. As a backbencher, I always sat in the same place, and it was absolutely true that the Speaker and deputies, if they knew somebody was in the same place, that was a good chance of being called to intervene. So you've been instrumental in my political appearances. So thank you very much for sharing your time, your expertise, and for telling us so much. It's always so interesting talking to you, and the House of Lords is very lucky to have your wisdom, though I get the impression you're enjoying it there.
Very much indeed, and well, thank you very much for your kind words. It's been a real pleasure to talk to somebody who's even more enthusiastic about Parliament, if possible, than I am.
Well, thank you very much. There was so much to reflect on following my conversation with Lord Lisvane, but I fear my ruminations are going to be intervened on in the next episode by a Member of Parliament whose commitment to the Chamber of the House of Commons is second to none. In episode 7, I will be exploring why Parliament works with none other than the Member for Strangford, Jim Shannon. Until then, goodbye.